I want you to picture a scenario. You've learned to wall off your feelings. Maybe it came from a past relationship, friendship, or even childhood itself. Somewhere along the way, you were taught to hide how you truly felt, because feeling became weakness, and weakness became something that left you scorched. You're talking to someone, anyone, maybe someone close to you, maybe someone who has known you long enough to notice the distance you keep between yourself and the people around you. And they ask the question, why are you so distant? Why do you never cry? Why is it that around the people closest to you, you still move through the world as if you're wearing a suit of armor? And as the words enter your ears, as you look into their eyes, the armor breaks. Not because you suddenly know what to say, because you realize you don't.
Tell me break a leg, I might actually do it. Pretending being fake. Now they think that I'm stupid. Take my own advice. Think that I should pursue it. I've lived 100 lives. Now I'm broken and foolish. Try to take out my own fears with nothing to lose. I wiped away quite a lot of tears for somebody who's wasting my time. At least you did it right. You got that magic in you, and you got me up your sleeve. I'll wash away on the shore. I'll watch you.
All my life, I've worn this invisible suit of armor. I don't mean that in the sense that I'm some naturally cold or detached person. I think the opposite is true. I think the armor exists because I have always been far too sensitive for my own good. Something as small as a shift in someone's tone can make me wonder if I've done something wrong. A delayed response can feel heavier than it should. A small change in someone's energy can sit in my head for hours. Even when I know logically that it might mean nothing, that kind of sensitivity is difficult to live with, especially when you're young, and you don't know how to explain it without sounding weak. And so eventually, you adapt. You learn to hide the evidence of how much things affect you. You learn to laugh things off before anyone can tell you they landed. You learn to act indifferent towards people you care about, because caring too openly feels like giving them access to a part of you they could ruin if they wanted to. That is where the armor begins. Not as strength, not as confidence, not as some noble form of self-control. It begins as fear that learned how to look composed. And the worst part is that it works. That's probably why I trusted it for so long. The armor gave me a way to survive my own sensitivity without having to publicly admit that I was sensitive. It allowed me to convert embarrassment into silence, silence into control, and control into something I could almost admire. If someone hurt me, I could make the injury look smaller by refusing to acknowledge it. If someone became distant, I could treat their distance as confirmation of something I had already prepared myself for. If I cared too much, I could bury that care under a kind of disciplined coldness and pretend I'd only chosen peace instead of avoidance. There is something intoxicating about appearing untouched. Not because you actually are untouched, but because the appearance itself becomes a form of revenge. The world wounds you, and instead of giving it the spectacle of your reaction, you withhold yourself. You become difficult to read. You make your face a sealed room. You let people wonder whether anything reached you at all. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to take pride in the very thing that was born from fear. German philosopher Nietzsche understood that pride can grow from strange soils. He was fascinated in the way people transform pain into identity. How a wound can become more than a wound once a person begins to organize his life around it. Because a person can suffer, but instead of simply suffering, he learns to give the suffering a posture. He makes it look intentional. He makes it look like taste, like strength, like a refusal to participate in the ordinary weakness of needing other people. That's the part that feels dangerous to me, because the armor does not remain a sad thing. At some point, it becomes imperative. To begin to admire yourself for enduring quietly. You become attached to the image of being unreachable. You treat emotional restraint as if it were proof of superiority, when sometimes it is only proof that the wound has become prideful enough to defend itself. A wound can become proud. It does not heal, but it learns how to stand upright. It learns how to speak calmly. It learns how to walk into a room and convince everyone, including you, that nothing is wrong. And because it no longer looks pathetic, because it no longer begs, because it no longer bleeds openly, you mistake it for strength. But Nietzsche's suspicion cuts into that illusion. He would ask whether this hardness actually belongs to you, or whether it was built by the very things that hurt you. He would ask whether your detachment is a creation of power, or merely the afterimage of old pain. There's a difference between overcoming something and arranging your entire personality around never having to face it directly. I do not know when my armor crossed that line. At first it was practical. It kept me from being humiliated by my own reactions. It gave me time to retreat, to think, to recompose myself before the world could see how quickly I had become affected. But the longer I wore it, the more it became connected to my sense of dignity. I did not just want to be protected anymore. I wanted to look like that kind of person who never needed protection in the first place. And that's where pride enters the wound. Because you begin by hiding the injury, and eventually you become insulted by the idea that anyone might notice it. You begin by wanting safety, and eventually you call your isolation maturity. You begin by fearing dependence, and eventually you turn not needing people into private religion. The armor becomes less about preventing pain and more about preserving the image of someone who cannot be reduced by it. And for a while, that image feels powerful. You walk around with this private belief that you have outgrown the ordinary need for reassurance. You tell yourself that you are simply different, that you are harder to reach because you have seen more, felt more, understood more. You begin to mistake emotional distance for depth. You begin to confuse silence with mastery. You begin to admire the very thing that is quietly separating you from everyone else. That is how the wound becomes a walk of pride. You limp long enough and eventually you convince yourself it is a style. But a life built around emotional invulnerability has a very short future. It can survive insults. It can survive rejection. Hell, it could even survive the little cruelties people commit without even knowing they have done anything. But what it cannot survive is tenderness. It does not know what to do when the threat is not humiliation, but rather intimacy. It does not know how to respond when someone is not trying to break through you out of malice, but because they're asking whether there's still a person under all of that restraint. That is where the coping mechanism begins to show its age. There are moments where the old methods suddenly feel primitive. Silence does not feel mysterious anymore. Sarcasm does not feel protective. Distance does not feel powerful. The mask that once gave you dignity starts to feel almost childish because the situation has changed and you are still responding to it with logic of an older wound. Someone asks for honesty and the body reaches for armor. Someone offers closeness and the instincts prepares for the impact. Someone tries to touch the part of you that still feels human, and some ancient defensive machinery inside of you treats their hand like a blade. That is the failure of the mask, because it works, but it doesn't know how to stop. It keeps going and it keeps working after its usefulness has expired. It continues to defend you from dangers that are no longer present. It continues to interpret vulnerability as surrender, affection as exposure, emotional honesty as a loss of control, and because it has been rehearsed for so long, it reacts faster than thought. Before you can choose openness, the armor has already chosen distance on your behalf. There comes a point where you cannot keep licking the wound in private and returning to the world polished. The wound starts demanding more than concealment. It wants language. It wants air. It wants to be acknowledged without immediately being converted into a joke, a silence, or some cold performance of being fine. When that moment comes, when there's finally a need to remove the mask and let something real pass through your face, your voice, your body, you discover how deeply the performance has settled into you. Sadness appears as withdrawal. Careness appears as restraint. Fear appears as composure, and wanting to be close to someone appears as preparing yourself to lose them. By the time emotions reach the surface, it has already been translated so many times by pride that even you barely recognize it. The mask does not simply hide the face. Worn long enough, it teaches the face that expressions are permitted. That's what I mean when I say the armor has become embedded. It has entered the reflexes. It lives in the pause before I answer, in the joke I make when the conversation gets too sincere, in the way I can feel something intensely and still behave as if the feeling belongs to someone else. It is not just a shield anymore. It's a discipline of concealment, practiced so often that it starts to feel like nature. And maybe that's why taking it off feels less like freedom than disfigurement, because the armor did not merely cover weakness. It gave my weakness a form I could tolerate. It made me presentable to myself. It allowed me to believe that the parts of me I found humiliating has been mastered, and when really they had only been forced into hiding. Nietzsche makes this uncomfortable because he does not let suffering remain innocent. He forces the question of what we have done with it. Have we used pain as material for becoming more alive, more honest, more capable of seeing clearly? Or have we made a small kingdom out of the wound, sitting inside like a ruler, proud only because we are still afraid to leave? I think the armor became the kingdom for me. A place where I could call distance strength and silence dignity. A place where I could convince myself that being hard to reach meant I had not been reached by anything. A place where I could keep my sensitivity alive without letting it embarrass me in public. But the cost of the kingdom is closeness, because eventually people stop knocking on metal. They stop asking for explanations from someone who has taught them not to expect one. They stop looking for softness in a person who keeps presenting himself as if softness has been burned out of him. And the cruelest part is that they're not entirely wrong for doing so. They're just responding to a version of me I've given them. That is the part I really just can't escape. The armor may have been built because I was hurt, but it is still mine now. It still shapes how I love, how I withdraw, how I punish people with distance, while pretending I'm only protecting myself. It still turns the need to be understood into the refusal to explain. It still lets me feel abandoned by people I've never fully allowed to approach. And so when the armor breaks, it does not feel heroic. It feels like being caught between the person I have been performing and the person who has been suffocating underneath the performance. Caught between the pride of being unreachable and the grief of realizing what that has cost. Caught between wanting to be known, but resenting the exposure required to make that possible. And maybe that's the real exhaustion of it. Not having feelings, but constantly managing their disappearance. Not being cold, but being trapped inside an old attempt to never look wounded again. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being unreachable by your own design. It's not the loneliness of having nobody around. It's far worse than that. It's being near people who may have loved you more clearly if you had ever allowed them to reach you without making them feel like they were trespassing. It's wanting that intimacy without the exposure that intimacy requires. And I think that contradiction is where most of the pain lives. I want to be protected and known at the same time. I want to be impossible to hurt, but still possible to love. I want someone to see through the armor without resenting me for wearing it. I want to be discovered without having to confess. But people cannot keep guessing forever. At some point, the armor becomes the only thing that they know how to respond to. They do not get the hidden version, the sensitive version, the one quietly affected by every small change in tone or distance. They get the composed version, the distanced version. The version that seems fine because he has practiced seeming fine with almost religious discipline. And then I get upset that they believed me. And that's what makes the whole thing so unfair. Not just to me, but to them. Because I can't keep presenting myself as untouchable and then resent people for not touching me gently. I can't keep acting like nothing hurts and then feeling betrayed when nobody knows where the wound is. I can't keep making myself unreadable and then expect to be understood as if love is supposed to be that kind of mind reading. The armor protects me, but it also lies for me. It tells people I'm okay when I'm not really okay. It tells them I do not need reassurance when I probably do. It tells them that I'm distant because I prefer distance, when sometimes distance is just the only form of closeness I know how to survive. It may have been built out of pain, but it still becomes my responsibility once I start using it against people who did not create the wound. That is where the pride starts to lose its elegance. It stops looking like survival and starts looking like avoidance with better posture. It stops looking like protection and starts looking like refusal to risk being human in front of anyone. I don't want to romanticize that. I don't want to make emotional unavailability sound mysterious or beautiful. There's nothing beautiful about making people feel alone while standing right next to them. There's nothing more profound about refusing to say what you feel until the silence becomes its own form of cruelty. There's nothing noble about turning your wounds into a personality and then asking everyone else to navigate the sharp edges. But I also do not want to pretend the armor came from nowhere. It came from somewhere. It came from being affected by things I did not know how to control. It came from realizing that other people could change my entire emotional state with a word, a delay, a shift in attention. It came from the shame of needing people more than I wanted to admit. It came from the humiliation that caring in a world where one person who cares less always seems to have better leverage. So I built something, or maybe I became something. I became the person who could take a hit, a person who can act like the loss was expected, a person who could smile at the exact moment he wanted to disappear, a person who could turn every wound into private discipline and every need into something too buried to be used against him. And for a while, I think I definitely admired that person. Maybe I still do, I don't know. But it's because he got me here. He protected me when I did not know what else to do. He taught me how to survive without constantly explaining the injury. He gave me structure when my emotions felt too chaotic to trust. But I can't pretend he is not also the reason I struggle to be reached. That's the difficult thing about outgrowing a coping mechanism. You're not simply throwing away something bad, you're confronting something that once saved you. You're looking at an older version of yourself and realizing that the thing he built out of necessity has become too heavy for the life you are trying to live now. The armor's not evil, it's just outdated. It belongs to an earlier battlefield, an earlier wound, an earlier version of me that needed protection more than he needed intimacy. That's what makes vulnerability feel impossible. It's not simply fear, it's the habit hardened into a reflex. It's the past interrupting the present before the present gets a chance to prove itself different. And I don't know how to fix that cleanly. I don't think that there is a clean ending to all of this. I don't think that I take the armor off at the end of the video and suddenly become some emotionally open person who knows how to say exactly what he feels. That would be a lie. And the entire point of this is that I'm so tired of lying through composure. I think the best I can do right now is admit the armor is there. I can admit that I've mistaken it for strength, admit that I've used it for pride, admit that I've hidden behind it, admired it, defended it, and maybe even punished people with it. Admit that I once wore this to survive, but in certain moments, it can make it harder to love. And maybe that's not healing yet. Maybe that's only the first crack. But a crack is still important. A crack means the surface is no longer perfect. A crack means some pressure from underneath has finally become stronger than the thing constraining it. A crack means the armor is not infinite, even if it feels embedded. Maybe the person underneath is not gone. Maybe he's just unused. Maybe he's been quiet for so long that his first attempts at honesty will come out awkward, late, uncertain, maybe even wrong. But maybe that's still better than letting the armor speak forever. Because the armor worked. That's the tragedy. It worked until I needed something more than protection. It worked until someone asked for the person underneath. And that's when I realized the thing I built to keep him safe had become the reason he could no longer answer.